Look closely at the most desperate, agonizing moments of your human life. When the crushing weight of financial ruin threatens your survival, or when a terrifying medical diagnosis shatters your world. What is your immediate reaction? Like 99% of humanity. You fall to your knees. You pray desperately, pleading and begging a distant, external God to miraculously intervene and change your terrifying circumstances. You cry out for healing. You beg for money. And you desperately ask for love. Yet, the agonizing silence remains, and nothing fundamentally transforms. Why do your most sincere, desperate prayers constantly fail? Prepare to confront a staggering, earth-shattering spiritual truth that will completely destroy the foundation of your religious conditioning. Goldsmith discovered the devastating mistake that keeps millions permanently trapped in a suffocating prison of limitation, the toxic, deeply ingrained belief that God is separate from you. When you pray from a state of agonizing lack, you violently reinforce that exact lack. When you desperately beg for healing, you are absolutely confirming the reality of your illness. The infinite divine absolutely never responds to human desperation. It is time to execute a radical, uncompromising halt to your exhausting human pleading. God is absolutely not a distant entity waiting to be convinced by your tears. God is the very consciousness you are. The moment you stop desperately asking and start silently knowing, the terrifying illusion of separation shatters. You must cease begging and begin being. Step into the absolute silence and recognize exactly who you are. The carnal mind is deeply conditioned to view prayer as a desperate, agonizing transaction. You kneel in the terrifying darkness of your human problems, violently pleading with an external deity to parachute into your chaotic existence and miraculously fix your failing biological body or your empty bank account. But you must confront a staggering, uncompromising spiritual truth. This exact desperate action is the fundamental mechanism that keeps 99% of humanity permanently trapped in a suffocating prison of material limitation. When you frantically pray from a state of agonizing lack, you are absolutely not inviting divine abundance. You are fiercely reinforcing the exact reality of that lack. When you desperately beg for a physical healing, you are fundamentally confirming and validating the terrifying existence of the illness. You are loudly declaring to the universe that you are a fragile, isolated mortal, separated from the infinite source of all good. Goldsmith discovered with earth-shattering clarity that the divine universe absolutely never, ever responds to human desperation. God is absolutely not a distant, external person waiting to be convinced by your bitter tears, your moral bargaining, or your exhausting spiritual techniques. God is the exact, silent consciousness that you fundamentally are in this very fraction of a second. The devastating mistake is the terrifying belief that divine power exists out there, separated by a vast, unbridgeable gap that you must forcefully cross through desperate pleading. This tragic, universal belief instantly creates the very separation that violently blocks all manifestation and healing. To experience profound, instantaneous transformation, you must execute a radical, uncompromising shift in your entire identity. You must completely stop asking and start silently knowing. You must immediately cease your exhausting human begging and begin majestically being. When you definitively recognize your true, indestructible identity as pure divine consciousness itself, prayer miraculously transforms from an agonizing, desperate plea into a profound, authoritative realization of absolute spiritual fact. This monumental understanding has completely revolutionized thousands of shattered lives. People who had violently struggled for agonizing decades with incurable illness, crushing poverty, and toxic relationship problems experienced instant, earth-shattering breakthroughs. These miracles did not occur through a better, more advanced technique of desperate asking, but through the profound, silent recognition of what they already undeniably are. The infinite divine is absolutely not traveling through time and space to rescue you. You are the exact divine, expressing itself flawlessly here and now. To truly comprehend the staggering, real-world magnitude of this absolute truth, witness the agonizing ordeal of Sarah, a woman who spent 15 exhausting years completely trapped in the suffocating, inescapable grip of severe chronic pain. She had desperately exhausted every single human avenue of relief. She had spent countless agonizing hours praying, crying, and violently begging God to miraculously take away her physical suffering. She had visited every conventional medical doctor and alternative spiritual healer, frantically searching the external material world for a physical cure. Yet, absolutely nothing worked. Because every desperate attempt was built upon the terrifying illusion that she was a broken human being separated from divine wholeness. Her entire paradigm violently shattered the moment she finally learned Goldsmith's ultimate secret. She completely stopped, desperately asking a distant god to heal her agonizing body. Instead, she radically shifted her internal axis and silently recognized a staggering, uncompromising spiritual fact as pure, infinite divine consciousness. The experience of physical pain was absolutely impossible to her true, eternal nature. The earth-shattering shift was immediate. Within mere days, the terrifying, agonizing pain simply began dissolving into the absolute void. You must realize with piercing clarity that Sarah absolutely did not receive a miraculous healing from the outside. She simply, majestically recognized that she had never, for a single fraction of a second, been separate from absolute divine wholeness. The crushing physical pain was undeniably real to her false, terrified sense of a separate self. But it was absolutely impossible and entirely non-existent to her true, indestructible spiritual identity. This profound transformation was not the cheap, fragile mechanism of human positive thinking, nor was it a psychological denial of a physical problem. It was the uncompromising recognition of an absolute spiritual fact. When you finally, definitively know yourself exclusively as divine consciousness, the terrifying conditions of human limitation absolutely cannot touch you. Disease, agonizing lack, and profound suffering exist exclusively in the dark. Hallucinatory illusion of separation. The moment you completely stop identifying as an exhausted, struggling human, and silently recognize yourself as divine consciousness, expressing perfectly. The heavy chains of your material prison violently shatter, and your entire world effortlessly transforms. Divine consciousness absolutely does not have human problems to desperately solve, because divine consciousness is the absolute, infinite solution itself. When you truly identify with your eternal nature, you do not forcefully overcome your earthly challenges. You suddenly see with breathtaking clarity that they never actually possessed a single ounce of reality in the first place. The ultimate. The devastating error that 99% of spiritual seekers commit is the desperate, exhausting attempt to aggressively change their material circumstances without ever fundamentally transforming their core identity. You are furiously attempting to rearrange the terrifying shadows on the wall while completely ignoring the light. Joel Goldsmith discovered that every single agonizing problem in your human existence, every physical disease, every crushing financial debt, every toxic relationship is entirely rooted in one tragic, hypnotic hallucination, the violent belief in separation. When you blindly identify as a fragile, struggling mortal fighting for survival in a hostile universe, your entire world will flawlessly reflect that terrifying limitation back to you. The absolute key to miraculous transformation is never found in manipulating your external conditions. It is found exclusively in the radical, uncompromising annihilation of your false human identity. When you definitively stop identifying as an exhausted human being and fiercely recognize yourself as pure divine consciousness, expressing perfectly, your entire material universe violently shifts. You must realize with earth-shattering clarity that divine consciousness absolutely does not have human problems to furiously solve. Because infinite consciousness is the absolute, flawless solution itself. You are not utilizing metaphysical theories or cheap positive affirmations. You are engaging in a staggering, uncompromising spiritual science that produces absolute, tangible results in the physical world. The moment you silently recognize your unbroken oneness with infinite divine life, the terrifying problem instantly dissolves back into the void. It is destroyed not through your desperate human struggle, but through the simple, authoritative recognition of what is eternally true about you. The absolute truth, when clearly seen, instantly dissolves all human error. You must relentlessly practice this uncompromising recognition throughout your chaotic day. When violently confronted with any material challenge, you absolutely must not kneel and desperately ask God to fix it. Instead, silently, authoritatively know, I am infinite divine consciousness. This terrifying problem possesses absolutely zero reality in my true being. Hold this absolute recognition until you deeply feel the staggering shift from agonizing human struggle to unshakable peace. For that silent peace is the ultimate indicator that you have touched absolute truth. To witness the staggering, real-world magnitude of this absolute identity shift, observe the terrifying ordeal of Marcus, a man who had built a massive earthly empire only to lose absolutely everything in a devastating economic crash. Staring directly into the agonizing abyss of crushing bankruptcy and a violently disintegrating family. His terrified carnal mind screamed for him to desperately fight back. The human ego demanded that he frantically hustle, aggressively manipulate his remaining assets, and exhaust himself trying to forcefully rebuild his shattered material life. But instead of plunging back into the agonizing battlefield of human effort, he completely surrendered to Goldsmith's absolute teachings. He executed a sudden, uncompromising halt to his desperate human striving. Instead of desperately trying to manipulate the external material world, he spent his time in the absolute, silent recognition of his true identity as pure divine consciousness. Flawlessly expressing infinite abundance and profound wisdom, he absolutely refused to validate the terrifying illusion of economic collapse. As this silent, majestic recognition deepened over several agonizing weeks, a staggering, earth-shattering transformation occurred. Breakthrough opportunities miraculously appeared from the absolute void. Bitter competitors suddenly offered lucrative partnerships, and conservative banks unexpectedly extended massive credit lines. Furthermore, the toxic, heavy stress that had suffocated his home completely dissolved, and his shattered family relationships miraculously healed. You must understand with piercing, uncompromising clarity, Marcus absolutely did not forcefully create this success. Nor did he magically manifest it through cheap psychological tricks. He simply, silently recognized that he had never, for a single fraction of a second, been separate from the absolute, infinite supply of the universe. The staggering transformation was not an overnight magical trick, but the flawless, natural result of perfectly aligning his identity with absolute spiritual truth. When he completely stopped identifying with the terrified, struggling businessman and definitively recognized himself exclusively as divine consciousness, his entire external experience flawlessly shifted to match this staggering internal reality. Boundless abundance naturally flowed because he fiercely recognized his unbroken oneness with the infinite source. This exact, uncompromising pattern replicates itself in every single area of your human existence. When you radically change your identity from an exhausted mortal to divine consciousness expressing perfectly, your material circumstances absolutely must align with this profound recognition. You never forcefully manipulate earthly conditions. You silently, majestically embody the absolute truth that instantly dissolves all sense of limitation and material lack into the empty void. The devastating illusion of the material sense does not merely ravage the physical biological form, it aggressively and violently terrorizes the fragile human mind. Consider the agonizing, suffocating hell experienced by Linda, a woman completely paralyzed by severe, crushing anxiety attacks that ruthlessly controlled her earthly existence for over a decade. She spent agonizing years desperately seeking temporary relief through traditional human psychological treatments, frantically fighting a violent, terrifying, and ultimately losing war against her own mind. The exhausting human therapies provided only fleeting comfort, but the suffocating, paralyzing fear always inevitably returned, because she was constantly fighting a phantom from the desperate level of the human ego. Through Joel Goldsmith's profound teachings, her entire paradigm was violently shattered. She learned to radically and uncompromisingly recognize her true, eternal nature as pure divine consciousness. She realized with earth-shattering clarity that infinite consciousness is absolute, undisturbed. Eternal peace, therefore. It is fundamentally and absolutely incapable of experiencing human fear. When the terrifying, agonizing panic attacks violently struck her human form, instead of desperately fighting the physical symptoms or frantically attempting to use cheap, positive thinking to calm her mind, she executed a sudden, uncompromising mental halt. She silently, authoritatively declared into the terrifying darkness, "I am infinite divine consciousness." This paralyzing human fear is absolutely impossible to my true, indestructible nature. This profound practice was absolutely not the fragile mechanism of psychological denial. It was the staggering recognition of an absolute, unbreakable spiritual fact. As this uncompromising truth became her living, breathing reality, the terrifying anxiety completely lost its venomous power to disturb her absolute inner peace. Over 3 months of relentless, silent recognition, the crushing anxiety completely dissolved into the empty void. She absolutely did not forcefully overcome human fear. She majestically recognized that, as divine consciousness, fear possessed absolutely zero reality in her eternal being. The terrifying chemical reactions, the chaotic racing thoughts, and the agonizing physical symptoms simply stopped appearing the exact moment their false, illusory foundation of separation was violently removed. Linda's staggering transformation proved with absolute certainty that profound psychological healing follows the exact same uncompromising spiritual principle as physical healing. When you definitively recognize your true identity, all terrifying conditions contrary to divine perfection naturally and effortlessly dissolve. This exact same uncompromising principle of divine recognition completely and violently shatters the terrifying external conflicts and bitter disputes of the human world. Witness the agonizing, terrifying ordeal of Robert, a man suddenly facing a devastating, malicious lawsuit that violently threatened to entirely destroy his earthly reputation and completely crush his finances. His human lawyers grimly predicted agonizing years of costly, bitter, and exhausting litigation with terrifyingly uncertain outcomes. The terrified carnal mind screamed for him to violently fight back, to desperately manipulate the legal system, and to aggressively attack his perceived human enemies with equal venom. Overwhelmed and standing on the absolute brink of earthly ruin, Robert radically shifted his entire axis of reality and engaged Goldsmith's staggering approach. He absolutely refused to fight the terrifying legal battle exclusively through exhausting, desperate human methods. Instead, he spent his days in the absolute, silent recognition of his unbroken oneness with infinite divine justice and flawless, limitless intelligence. He absolutely did not foolishly or delusionally deny the earthly appearance of the legal reality, but he fiercely, uncompromisingly refused to accept it as his absolute spiritual reality. He recognized with earth-shattering clarity that as pure, infinite divine consciousness, he existed entirely and permanently beyond the suffocating, terrifying realm of human conflict and material limitation. This staggering, silent recognition instantly brought an inexplicable, profound peace that defied all human logic. Within 2 short months, the absolutely impossible happened in the material world. The hostile opposing party unexpectedly and completely withdrew the devastating lawsuit. Furthermore, new, undeniable evidence miraculously surfaced from the void that entirely and flawlessly vindicated Robert's position. His baffled, exhausted human lawyers called it a staggering, inexplicable miracle. But Robert definitively knew it was merely the flawless, natural, and inevitable result of recognizing his true identity as divine consciousness, expressing perfect, absolute justice. The ultimate, earth-shattering key was not kneeling in terror and desperately praying for a human legal victory, but silently, majestically recognizing that as infinite consciousness, he was permanently untouched by human discord. When you definitively know yourself exclusively as divine consciousness, every single terrifying conflict violently dissolves into the nothingness from which it came. Because absolute, unbreakable harmony is your only true, eternal, and indestructible state. Beyond the foundational realization of your true identity, Joel Goldsmith taught specific, uncompromising techniques designed to radically deepen and permanently anchor this earth-shattering spiritual understanding into your daily existence. The first absolute practice is conscious contact. This is absolutely not the desperate, pleading prayer of the carnal mind. Nor is it a traditional human meditation where you frantically try to forcefully achieve a temporary state of psychological peace. It is the intimate, to silent, and fiercely authoritative recognition of your true, indestructible identity. You must ruthlessly carve out 15 minutes every single morning and every single evening to completely and violently sever yourself from the chaotic, suffocating noise of the human world. Sit in absolute, undisturbed silence and majestically recognize, I am infinite, divine consciousness, flawlessly expressing it. Send yourself right here, right now. You must execute a sudden, violent halt to all frantic human thinking during this sacred time. Absolutely do not analyze your terrifying earthly problems. Do not mentally wrestle with your physical diseases. And do not desperately visualize your human desires. You must simply rest in the pure, naked recognition of your eternal spiritual identity. This uncompromising, daily practice builds the absolute, unshakable foundation for miraculous transformation. As you relentlessly practice this silent recognition, you will inevitably witness a staggering, inexplicable shift in the texture of your entire human day. Terrifying earthly challenges will violently lose their venomous power to disturb your inner equilibrium. Because you are firmly anchored in absolute spiritual truth, rather than being tossed around by the fleeting, deceptive appearances of the material world. Other struggling human beings will naturally begin responding to you completely differently. Not because you successfully manipulated their human egos, but because you are functioning entirely from the breathtaking majesty of your divine nature, rather than from the desperate, suffocating prison of human limitation and fear. The more you intimately commune with your absolute divine nature, the more your temporary human experience flawlessly reflects this staggering truth. Start this uncompromising practice immediately. and watch the terrifying illusions of your mortal life miraculously transform into undeniable expressions of absolute divine order. The second profound, earth-shattering technique Goldsmith demanded is instant recognition during the terrifying heat of daily human challenges. The exact fraction of a second you notice any form of agonizing human discord, paralyzing worry, violent danger, or crushing financial lack, you must immediately and fiercely recognize that this dark condition is absolutely impossible in the infinite divine consciousness which you fundamentally are. You must absolutely never analyze the terrifying problem. And you must never try to desperately figure out an exhausting human solution. You must instantly recognize your absolute, eternal immunity to it. This fierce, uncompromising practice violently interrupts the chaotic, downward momentum of negative human experience and radically redirects your entire attention back to absolute spiritual truth. Instead of getting violently sucked into the agonizing drama of human suffering, you instantly anchor yourself in the indestructible, silent peace of your divine nature. This radical, instantaneous shift in identification completely revolutionizes everything in the material world. For example, when suddenly faced with crushing financial pressure that violently threatens your earthly survival, instead of suffocating in the dark terror of lacking money, you must silently, authoritatively recognize infinite divine consciousness lacks absolutely nothing. As pure divine consciousness, I am eternally complete and infinitely supplied. You must relentlessly hold this absolute recognition until you visibly feel the staggering internal shift from agonizing human anxiety to deep, unshakable peace. For that profound peace is the ultimate, absolute indicator that you have successfully touched spiritual truth. Furthermore, Joel taught the staggering technique of spiritual discernment, the absolute ability to definitively distinguish between what is eternally true in divine consciousness and what merely appears terrifyingly real to the fragile human senses. This profound discernment develops your uncompromising ability to see directly through thick, suffocating human problems to the radiant spiritual reality that dissolves them entirely automatically. Whenever you are violently confronted with any earthly challenge, you must fiercely demand of yourself, is this terrifying condition actually possible in absolute divine consciousness? Since divine consciousness is perfect life, infinite intelligence, and boundless abundance, anything contrary to these majestic qualities possesses absolutely zero reality in your true being. When you handle the terrifying, practical matters of the human world directly from this silent foundation of knowing exactly who you really are, breakthrough solutions appear completely naturally and effortlessly. You absolutely stop acting from a place of desperate human terror and begin moving entirely with the absolute strength, flawless wisdom, and breathtaking grace of the infinite universe. The ultimate, advanced technique Joel Goldsmith demanded from his students is the profound, it's silent, and uncompromising practice of recognition for others. The desperate carnal mind constantly wants to aggressively fix, self-righteously preach to, or forcefully manipulate the broken human beings around us, secretly feeding its own arrogant, earthly superiority. But you must execute a sudden, uncompromising halt to this toxic, exhausting savior complex. When you encounter a human being who appears to be violently struggling with severe illness, crushing poverty, or deeply toxic behavior, you absolutely must not try to forcefully change their fragile human personality or frantically convince them of their spiritual reality through useless human words. Instead, you must look directly through the dense, terrifying illusion of their physical and psychological suffering and silently, fiercely recognize their absolute spiritual perfection. You must authoritatively know this person is pure, infinite, divine consciousness, flawlessly expressing itself. What appears completely contrary to this absolute truth possesses zero reality in their true, indestructible being. You hold this staggering recognition in absolute, unbroken silence, without ever arrogantly telling them what you are doing. By fiercely refusing to hold another human being in the dark, agonizing prison of your limited material judgment, you actively create a silent, sacred atmosphere that effortlessly supports their own natural awakening to truth. You must relentlessly practice this profound recognition with your bitter family members, hostile co-workers, and even the terrifying, tragic figures you witness in the daily news. This uncompromising practice completely shatters the deeply ingrained human habit of judging physical appearances and miraculously develops your capacity for absolute, unconditional love and practical, earth-shattering healing ability. As you consistently deploy these profound, absolute techniques, daily conscious contact, instant mental redirection, spiritual discernment, and silent recognition for others, your entire baseline of consciousness violently and permanently transforms. You completely stop identifying with the exhausted, limited human condition and begin functioning entirely as absolute divine perfection. This monumental, staggering shift in your core identity naturally and effortlessly revolutionizes every single aspect of your material existence, permanently turning your ordinary daily life into a majestic, unbroken expression of infinite divine grace. Yet, as you rigorously step into this absolute spiritual authority, you will inevitably collide head-on with the two most paralyzing, venomous weapons of the human ego, crushing doubt and frantic impatience. The fragile human mind will violently resist recognizing divine perfection when terrifying material circumstances appear to entirely contradict it. This agonizing doubt tries to forcefully validate the terrifying physical problem and completely invalidate the absolute spiritual truth. But Goldsmith addressed this universal obstacle with staggering, uncompromising wisdom. He revealed that you absolutely do not need to intellectually understand exactly how spiritual recognition works. You simply need to practice it with relentless, fierce consistency. Absolute truth operates entirely by its own infinite power. Absolutely never by your fragile human comprehension of it. When paralyzing doubt violently strikes your mind, you must absolutely never fight it, and you must never sink into the toxic, suffocating swamp of spiritual guilt. You simply treat the dark, agonizing doubt as just another empty, false condition, and immediately return to the majestic recognition, I am infinite divine consciousness. This human doubt possesses absolutely no reality in my eternal, indestructible being. Furthermore, you must ruthlessly annihilate the carnal mind's exhausting, frantic impatience for immediate material results. The desperate ego constantly demands instant, magical transformation in the physical world and becomes violently discouraged when the earthly shadows seem slow to change. But you must realize an earth-shattering spiritual fact: true, absolute recognition works entirely at the foundational level of consciousness first, and the visible material form only shifts as a secondary, natural byproduct. The exact timing of the physical manifestation belongs exclusively to the flawless, infinite intelligence of the divine. Absolutely never to your desperate, frantic human desire. You must completely stop desperately focusing on the external, material results and instead focus entirely on the immediate, profound internal result of your recognition, the absolute, silent peace that effortlessly floods your being. That unshakable, silent peace is the ultimate indicator that your consciousness has fundamentally shifted. And that profound internal shift is the actual healing. You must completely relax into this silent recognition rather than violently striving for earthly results. When you entirely remove the agonizing pressure of human performance, you step out of the ego's frantic timeline and allow absolute truth to operate flawlessly, miraculously accelerating the manifestation process beyond anything your human mind could ever comprehend. The deepest, most paralyzing, and venomous fortress the human ego constructs to violently block your spiritual awakening is the crushing, agonizing weight of past human guilt. Millions of sincere seekers violently torture themselves over historical earthly mistakes, moral failures, and agonizing personal limitations, falsely and tragically believing that their flawed human history permanently disqualifies them from ever experiencing absolute divine perfection. The desperate ego deeply relies on your toxic self-hatred and endless remorse to maintain its fragile, terrifying grip on your reality. This suffocating guilt is the carnal mind's ultimate, terrifying weapon to keep you permanently trapped in the devastating illusion of separation. But Joel Goldsmith addressed this universal human agony with profound, uncompromising, and earth-shattering clarity. The terrified, confused mortal who committed those earthly errors was absolutely never your true, eternal identity. Your actual, indestructible identity as pure divine consciousness is, and has always been, eternally pristine, flawless, and absolutely perfect. Guilt can only exist within the dark, hallucinatory nightmare of a separate, isolated human self. It possesses absolutely zero reality in the majestic, unbroken light of your divine nature. When the agonizing specter of past guilt violently attacks your mind, you must execute a sudden, uncompromising halt and authoritatively recognize: infinite divine consciousness has never, for a single fraction of a second, made a human mistake, and it is absolutely incapable of experiencing earthly guilt. As pure divine consciousness, I am eternally pure, intouchable, and perfect. You absolutely must not endlessly analyze your past human errors. And you must never desperately beg a distant God for psychological forgiveness. You must ruthlessly sever your false identification with the phantom self that sinned, and radically accept your present, absolute spiritual reality. This staggering recognition instantly and completely dissolves the suffocating chains of human guilt. Because absolute divine forgiveness is completely automatic, the exact moment you realize the human sinner was nothing more than a passing, insubstantial shadow. You absolutely do not have to forcefully achieve a state of spiritual purity. You simply majestically accept the staggering truth that you have never, ever lost it. The heavy, agonizing burden of human performance is completely annihilated, allowing a natural, flawless transformation to effortlessly emerge from the silent void. As you violently shed this heavy, agonizing armor of human guilt, you step entirely into the profound, absolute realm of the advanced spiritual practitioner. You completely stop being a desperate, exhausted human frantically seeking to contact the divine occasionally, and you begin the staggering, majestic practice of living continuously as divine consciousness itself. You absolutely no longer have designated, rigid hours of spiritual practice, because your entire breathing existence becomes an unbroken, sacred expression of the infinite. This absolute, uncompromising integration must penetrate the most intense, chaotic trenches of your daily human existence. Whether you are navigating a terrifying financial crisis, raising human children, or sitting in a hostile corporate boardroom, you absolutely must maintain the silent, unbroken recognition that you are infinite consciousness, flawlessly expressing its divine intelligence in that exact physical location. You absolutely do not become weak, passive, or detached from human suffering. Rather, you transform into a staggering, unstoppable force of divine effectiveness. Because every single decision now flows effortlessly from infinite wisdom rather than from paralyzed human fear or desperate egoic manipulation. Furthermore, you must aggressively step into the ultimate, earth-shattering realization that divine consciousness is the absolute, only presence and power in the entire universe. You must fiercely, uncompromisingly refuse to acknowledge any competing earthly force, any opposing material power, or any alternative human reality. When you look out at the terrifying, chaotic tragedies of the global world, you must not react with blind, emotional human panic or desperate political activism. You must look directly through the dense, suffocating illusion of collective human evil and silently, authoritatively recognize that what appears contrary to absolute divine good possesses absolutely zero structural reality in the true, eternal being. Evil, disease, and worldly lack only appear to possess terrifying power when they are blindly validated by the false. Human belief in separation. When divine consciousness becomes your only, uncompromisingly recognized reality, the terrifying worldly shadows instantly lose their venomous bite. And what the sleeping world calls impossible miracles become your everyday. natural, and effortless experience. You finally realize the ultimate. It's staggering truth. You are not forcefully trying to make something magnificent happen in the material world. You are simply silently being the absolute. Perfect truth that automatically dissolves every single illusion it touches. We have reached the absolute, earth-shattering culmination of your spiritual existence. The ultimate. Staggering secret Joel Goldsmith revealed is that divine consciousness is absolutely never a distant, shiny prize you painfully attain through exhausting human effort. It is exactly what you eternally, undeniably are. The agonizing, lifelong human journey, from believing in a terrifying separation to knowing your unbroken oneness, completely ends right here. In this exact holy fraction of a second, you must realize with piercing, uncompromising clarity that every single desperate prayer, every bitter tear, and every frantic attempt to forcefully become more spiritual was entirely based on the devastating hallucination that you were not already whole. You are absolutely not a fragile, exhausted human being, desperately trying to have occasional spiritual experiences. You are pure, infinite divine consciousness, deliberately having a temporary human experience. What you desperately sought in the external material world has always been your very own nature. What you violently tried to become, you already perfectly are. What you frantically hope to achieve in some distant future is your absolute, present reality. When this staggering, uncompromising truth finally becomes your living, breathing reality, your entire relationship with existence radically transforms from a desperate, agonizing struggle into a magnificent, effortless celebration. The heavy, suffocating prison of your false human identity completely shatters into the silent void. You absolutely no longer have to frantically pray to bridge an imaginary, terrifying gap between yourself and the divine. Because the exhausted seeker and the majestic divine you sought were never, for a single heartbeat, two different things. Take a deep, silent breath right now. Drop the exhausting, the heavy burden of desperately pleading with the universe, and simply, majestically accept your absolute, infinite perfection. If this profound, earth-shattering revelation has finally dissolved your terrifying human illusions and awakened you to your true, indestructible identity, I invite you to leave 3 simple, unbreakable words in the comments below. I am transformed. Let this be the silent, eternal seal of your absolute awakening. Rest now and forever in the flawless, infinite peace of exactly who you are.